He bid 22 cents for a toothless 52-year-old, refused 13 times in 3 towns. The auctioneer had yellow teeth and a way of looking past a person that made you feel you'd already left the room. I remember the exact weight of the coins in my palm, 22 cents, 3 nickels and 7 pennies. I'd been counting them since Dodge, rolling them between my fingers the way some men work a rosary, though I had no particular faith in anything at that point and hadn't for some years. The coins were warm from my hand. The morning was cold. There is something about that I've never been able to square. Her name was Clara Foss. I didn't know it yet. She was standing on a wooden platform in the yard of the Granger County Poor Farm, November of 1889, and the wind was doing something mean off the flats, just enough to make a person's eyes water so you couldn't tell if they were crying. She was wrapped in a coat that had been brown once and was on its way to becoming something that didn't have a color anymore. Her hair was gray and it wasn't arranged, and when she turned her head, I could see her jaw had gone hollow on both sides where the teeth had come out. She was 52 years old. The auctioneer said so, said it like it was a liability. He also said she'd been refused in Hayes, in Larned, in both ends of Dodge City. 13 times total, he was honest enough to say, though the way he said it was meant to put people off, not inform them. The bidding had been at a nickel, and it died there. I don't know what I thought I was doing. I'm still not entirely sure. I had a quarter section northeast of Sweetwater Creek that needed a second pair of hands, and I had 22 cents to my name and about $40 of debt against the land, and I was 48 years old myself, and had been living on salt pork and stubbornness since my wife Alina died of the fever 3 winters prior. I was not a man in any kind of position. I want to be clear about that. I had gone to the auction because my neighbor Hedrick went, and I'd ridden alongside him, and I hadn't intended to bid on anything, and then I was bidding. 22 cents. The auctioneer looked at me the way a man looks at something he suspects might be broken. Nobody raised it. He waited longer than he needed to. I think he was hoping I'd feel the shame of it and withdraw because the whole thing had an ugliness to it, and 22 cents was the ugliness made plain. But I held still. My name is Amos Garrett. I've held still through worse. He brought the hammer down. She didn't look at me when I walked up. I stood beside her while the auctioneer did his paperwork, and she stared at some point in the middle distance beyond the fence, and her jaw was set. Not fragile, not grateful, just set, the way you'd set your feet on ground you weren't sure of. I said, I have a wagon. She said, I can see that. I said, it's about 11 miles. She said, I heard you bid 22 cents. Yes. Was that all you had? Yes. She looked at me then, not soft, not assessing exactly, just straight, the way very few people look at a person. All right, she said. We drove 11 miles, and she didn't ask me a single question about what she was walking into, and I didn't volunteer anything. And by the time we reached the cutoff towards Sweetwater, the silence had settled into something that wasn't uncomfortable. The land was brown, and the sky was that deep winter blue that has no warmth in it at all, and somewhere past the creek a hawk was working a thermal, barely moving, just holding. She saw it too. I know because she tracked it for a long time without saying anything, and eventually she said, red-tailed. Usually is, I said. That was about it for the first day. The house was what it was. I want to tell it straight. 1 room, a loft, a stove that drew good in a south wind and sulked in a north wind, 2 windows that had old paper in them instead of glass because I'd had glass and the hail of '87 had settled that question. A plank table. 2 chairs, a rope bed in the corner and a straw tick in the loft. Alina's quilt on the bed, which I still used because it was warm and because getting rid of it had seemed like a thing that could wait. Clara stood in the door and looked at it. Chickens, she said. 6, they're somewhere. Milk cow. Dead. Last spring. Pigs. 1, she's old. Gardens. Was come spring. She nodded. She didn't say anything about the state of things, which were poor. She went to the stove and built up the fire, and when I came back in from putting up the horses, the place smelled different. She'd found the onions I'd forgotten I had, and she had them in a pan with a little of the salt pork, and the smell of it hit me in a way I wasn't prepared for. I hadn't eaten anything hot that smelled like someone had made it on purpose in a long time. I ate at one end of the table, and she ate at the other. She slept in the loft. I put Alina's quilt up there and took the spare blanket for myself. It was a cold night. And the stove kept the middle of the room warm and the corners cold, and I lay in the dark thinking about the 22 cents and what exactly I'd done and what I thought I was going to do next. I don't think I'd have called it loneliness before. I'd have called it something more manageable, keeping my head down, getting through the season, owing nobody. A man can do that for a long time. He can mistake it for fine. She worked. I want to say that plainly because it matters and because I had not expected it, not at that level. I had expected, I don't know what I'd expected. Someone who needed things done for them, maybe. Someone I'd have to lead through the work. By the end of the first week, she had found where my tools were actually kept versus where I thought they were, and she'd fixed the hinge on the chicken house door that had been bad since summer, and she'd set up a system with the water barrel that saved 2 trips a day to the creek, and she'd done it all without saying much and without any apparent need for me to acknowledge it. She just moved through problems the way water moves around a stone, without drama. I am not a man who talks a great deal. Eleanor used to say I was the quietest man in any room I walked into, which wasn't quite a compliment. Clara seemed to require about as much conversation as I did, which was not much, and what we said to each other had a directness to it that I found easier than most talk. She'd say, "That corner post needs resetting before the ground freezes," and I'd go look at it, and she'd be right, and we'd spend the afternoon on it without much more between us than the work. She was strong, not just willing, genuinely strong in her hands and her back. She'd worked a farm before. Her husband had been dead 4 years. She didn't tell me much more than that for a while, and I didn't ask, and that suited us both. What I noticed, though, little things. She had a way of going still when she was thinking, the way a hunting dog goes still, not frozen, just focused, everything gathered in. She could tell whether by the way the horses held their heads. She knew every plant on the place inside of 2 weeks and had opinions about which ones were useful and which were trouble. She had been refused 13 times, and it hadn't made her small. It had made her, I want to get this right, it had made her patient, maybe. Like a person who'd been tested enough times that they'd stopped being surprised by difficulty and just started working around it. The day she laughed for the first time, I remember thinking, oh, that's what that sounds like. It was on account of the pig. Old Ida Eleanor had named her. I just kept the name. Old Ida had gotten into the root cellar somehow, which should have been impossible, and had eaten about 1/3 of the winter squash and was looking satisfied. Clara looked at her and looked at the squash and looked at me and just started laughing. Not politely, actually laughing. And I laughed too, which I hadn't done in long enough that it surprised me. And for a minute we were just 2 people in a cold root cellar laughing at an old pig, and it was plain. Just plain and good. December came down hard. The blizzard on the 14th was the worst I'd seen since '86, and it pinned us inside for 3 days. We burned through wood faster than I liked, and by the second day I was rationing the stove, keeping it just enough to stay above dangerous, and we sat close to it, both of us in our coats, and the wind hit the north wall like something that wanted in. I was not doing well. I hadn't said anything about it, but she could see it, I think. The cold gets into old injuries, and I had a right knee from a horse fall years back that swells in hard weather, and an old rifle wound in my left shoulder from a disagreement I'd had in Tascosa in '77 that I'd mostly made my peace with, but not in cold this serious, and I was moving like an old machine and trying not to show it. 3rd day of the blizzard, I couldn't quite get up from the chair without my hands on the arms, and I made some noise doing it, and she was across the room before I'd finished standing. She didn't ask. She just put her hands on the shoulder, both hands, one on the front and one on the back, careful, feeling where the damage was. Her hands were rough and warm, and she worked the muscle slow and careful, and I sat very still because I hadn't been touched like that since Eleanor, and I didn't know exactly what to do with it. "Horse fall," she said. "Rifle ball long time ago." She worked on it for a while longer without saying anything. "You've got one more good winter in this shoulder," she said. "After that you're going to need someone doing the high work." I didn't say anything. "I'm not going anywhere, Amos," she said. "I want you to understand that." I looked at her. She was close enough that I could see the lines around her eyes and the gray in her hair and the way her jaw sat, that same set I'd seen on the auction platform, firm and decided. Not soft, just sure. "You stayed through all of this," I said. "I didn't mean the blizzard." "You bid 22 cents, she said. She said it like it explained everything. Maybe it did. I've turned it over enough times that I think I understand what she meant, not the money, which was nothing but the fact of it. that a man with nothing to spare had bid what he had. I put my hand over hers where it rested on my shoulder. We stayed like that for a while, close to the stove while the blizzard worked the walls, and I felt something ease in me that had been tightened up for 3 years, maybe longer. There is a thing that happens to a man when he has been alone a long time. He stops expecting. Not just the big things, love, company, someone to know him, but the small ones. He stops expecting that anyone will notice whether he's done a good job, or that his judgment on a thing is sound, or that the way he figures a problem has any value. He just does the work and it's done, and that's the whole of it. And after enough seasons of that, it starts to feel like the natural order. I'm trying to explain what it did to me when Clara started asking my opinion about things. She wasn't asking because she didn't know. She usually knew. But she'd say, "What do you think about moving the chicken house over closer to the barn, closer to water and heat?" And I'd think about it, and I'd say what I thought, and she'd consider it, and then we'd figure out together what to do, and my figuring was part of the answer. It sounds like nothing. But after years of making every decision alone and having nobody to know whether you'd made it right, to have a person who asked and meant it and took it seriously, I can't fully explain what that did. She said to me once, late January, we were at the table with coffee and the lamp going, she said, "You're a careful man. I don't mean slow. I mean you think about the edges of things before you step." I didn't know what to say to that. My husband wasn't, she said. He was quick and usually right and sometimes very wrong, and I always had to watch the corners for him. You don't need that. Eleanor used to say I was too careful, I said. Maybe she needed quick, I don't. She wrapped both hands around her cup. "I'm glad you bid," she said, quiet, just that. I looked at this woman across my table in the lamplight, gray-haired and toothless, 52 years old and refused 13 times, wrapped in her patched coat in my cold house, and she looked back at me and I thought, she sees me. Not the quarter section or the debt against it or the busted shoulder or what was left of my face after 50 years of weather. She sees Amos Garrett. She has decided something about Amos Garrett, and she has decided he is worth the staying. I can't tell you what that's worth. There is no number. February, the mare threw a shoe out on the north pasture, and I went after her in a wind that had real teeth in it, and I found her easy enough, but coming back, I caught my bad knee on a rock I didn't see under the snow and went down hard, and the cold and the pain and 3 years of bad sleep and bad food and not enough of either caught up to me all at once, and I just sat there. In the snow. For longer than I should have. She found me. She came out with the big coat on and a lantern, and she got down in the snow beside me without saying anything about it, and got her arm around my back and just waited. Let me get my feet under me again. She didn't pull and she didn't hurry me, and she didn't make it something it needed to be made into. When I was up, she kept her arm where it was until I had the mare's lead in my other hand, and we walked back together, the 3 of us in the dark and the cold. Inside, she sat me in the chair closest to the stove, and she went for the whiskey I kept in the back of the cupboard, the one I hadn't opened since Eleanor died, and she set it in front of me and sat across from me. And she didn't say "I told you so" about the shoulder or the cold or any of it, and she didn't ask how I felt, and she didn't look at me with pity. She looked at me straight, the way she had on that auction platform. "You're going to have a good spring," she said. It wasn't a question. "AMIs. You are, the wheat's going to take." I looked at the seed. "You've got good seed. The pig's going to give us at least 1 good litter. And the knee is going to be all right. You just have to stop doing stupid things alone in the dark." "Mostly they stay stupid," I said. "Not this one." She poured a small measure into her own cup. "You've got someone watching the corners now." I took the whiskey and held it and let the warmth from the stove work on my hands and the cold work out of my knee. And I looked at Clara Foss, who had been refused 13 times, and had ridden 11 miles in November with a man she didn't know for 22 cents, and who had stayed through a blizzard and a bad winter and the general poverty of my circumstances, and who showed no sign of having made a mistake. She wasn't looking at me like I was a project. She wasn't looking at me like she was settling. She was looking at me like I was exactly what she'd been looking for, and she was satisfied, and she'd made her decision, and that was that. I put my hand flat on the table. After a moment, she put hers over it. The spring was good. She was right about the wheat. She was right about Ida's litter, 7 pigs, 6 of them healthy. We got the chicken house moved, and I put in 2 windows with actual glass after I sold the first 3 pigs, and Clara made curtains out of something she'd had in her trunk, a blue cloth that I hadn't known was there, and the light in the room changed. I'm going to tell you one more thing, and then I'm done. In April, after the planting, I went to town for supplies and I talked to Hedrick, who had been at the auction in November, who had watched me bid 22 cents and not said a word. He said to me, "How's it working out, Amos?" It wasn't quite a question. I said it was working out fine. He said she seemed, I don't know, particular. She is, I said. You sure you got the better end of that? I thought about the shoulder. I thought about the snow. I thought about the pie she'd made with the last of the dried apples in March, and the blue curtains, and the sound of her laughing in the root cellar, and the way she'd said, "I'm not going anywhere, Amos," like it was a settled matter, like there was nothing further to discuss. I thought about being seen. Yeah, I said. I'm sure. I drove home. The land was green by then, just starting, that particular thin bright green of a plains April that doesn't last and is the better for it. Clara was in the garden when I came up the lane, down on her knees working the soil, and she looked up and saw me coming, and she stood, brushing her hands on her apron, and she watched me drive in like she was glad I was back, which she was, and which I knew. 22 cents. There are men who would call that the worst trade they ever heard of. I'm not one of them.